Hello, so today I'm at Mercer County Pole Farm. I'll explain what that is. But if you see the area behind me, I'm standing on it. So it's under my feet too. If you see that area, this has been the site very recently, as of Thursday, of a prescribed burn. I will explain why we use prescribed burns as we go along in the course of this video. But this is a management technique. This was an intentional prescribed burn. So again, here's the land that has been burned through this prescribed burn, this management technique in order to maintain this area as a grassland. And grasslands here are an area of habitat that is declining. So we're trying to make sure that this land stays grassland as you see across the street, and eventually this burned land will become that again. Grass is fairly resilient, and it will bounce back into this type of habitat as you're witnessing in front of me. If you were to leave it alone, it would most likely turn into the deciduous forest that surrounds it. As the seeds from the forest wind up becoming established, the soil here is not that sandy, although somewhat sandy, but it's not that sandy, and that is one thing that would prevent deciduous trees from really being able to take over. So one technique that we can use is to have that fire, as grasslands often are a fire-dependent ecosystem in this way. So that fire would kill off any seedlings that really are trying to establish, although there are some that will still establish themselves, but not too many. And eventually, if you keep setting those fires and maintaining that management technique, hopefully this stays a grassland. That's what we're trying to do here at Mercer County Pole Farm. So you can see they also don't let people into this area when the fires are going, of course. But we need this disturbance for this type of habitat. And why do we care so much? Well, there are different species that rely on this type of habitat. And for biodiversity's sake, we do try to maintain as many different types of species as we can, and there's a lot to that. And we can talk about being stewards and stewardship. We could also talk about, from a scientific and biological standpoint, why different ecosystem types are important. So this is a particularly large, we need large tracts of land that are interconnected. And we do have some connections, even from the different forests here, that connect to each other for the forested animals and plants. But also, we need interconnected grasslands as much as we can, even though in some sense they have always been somewhat patchwork throughout our landscape. So area-sensitive grassland species include things like short-eared owls, which need large enough tracts of land in order to be attracted to that plot and be able to maintain their presence on that plot. Grasshopper sparrows also. We'll see what we see here today. Okay. As you can see in the sign, this was once owned by AT&T, and when they were working on transcontinental and transatlantic telephone lines, this had large steel towers, antennae, and it was used for that purpose. Now, we have restored it into a grassland habitat, which is being used for multiple purposes by people, and you can see that also by the animals and plants that live here. So realize that, again, grassland species, if they're animals and birds, for example, need a fair amount of habitat. Why? Partly because they need to be territorial to some extent, or at least be heard, since it usually can't be seen, especially when the grass is a bit taller. You'll see in the back that there's some tall grass. They do mow the grass as well as burn the grass here too. So maintaining those territories, as a lot of those birds do, that means take some space, and that way population numbers don't get to be too large. Now there are some that are not as territorial, but in the case of grasshopper sparrows, when they're breeding, for example, they do need some space, and they do maintain them by seeding. So this brings up the idea of why do we restore land to, and what do we restore land back to, if it ever was this? And I actually don't know the land use history before AT&T had the land. So it's an interesting question. This is obviously a need, a natural need for this area. So it does make sense to maintain it for this purpose and to let people enjoy it as well. As I'm walking down this path for a little bit, and there's a vernal pool of sorts. I don't think that is permanent at all. You'll see it's not a completely homogeneous landscape. I don't know if you could see the harrier in the sky that just happens to be flying over, so I try to get that if I can. Where'd he go? Over there somewhere. Probably not in this video. But anyway, hey. Just want to talk about the plants anyway. There you go. So if you take a look at the differences between a grassland, which you clearly see here, and maybe you can even see the harrier somehow in there. He is there somewhere. Still trying. He's in that shot if you can see him. Anyway, so in a grassland, things that you notice, the abiotic factors here are harsh. You have bright sunlight, and there's no really protection from it. There's no shade. It's one thing that happens as deciduous trees grow up and outcompete the grasses for light. There becomes shade on the ground, and some shade-tolerant species can grow. But also, it's very windy, as you probably heard on this video already. And not all of these are grasses, by the way. Grasses have flat blades, whereas reeds have rounded, and there's a lot of reeds here. And rushes are square-shaped. But if you take a look at the edge of the forest, it gets some of these same conditions. It gets a high mass of precipitation that can go straight into there. It gets the wind, gets a lot of that sunlight, much unlike the interior forest as well. So you have a mix of habitat types here, and the interior forest here is quite extensive, actually. Extensive enough that some area-sensitive interior forest birds can live there, such as the saw-whet owl in the wintertime. They even have a banding program here that they monitor the saw-whet owls, which you don't get many saw-whet owls in a lot of places because you just don't have that type of land. So maintaining large swaths of land that are interconnected, especially when they're not interconnected, you're really fragmenting the landscape even more and creating those fragmented habitat islands, which if you look into island biogeography, you'll see why species are limited. And you can absolutely increase the biodiversity of a larger landscape if you do interconnect them. This is one aspect of the intersection between humans and nature. This is multiple use path, but it's also trying to help out our little buddies, in this case owls. You know, sometimes when we have photographers come out into nature, they get a little too close and they disturb owls, which are very secretive, and they're sleeping during the daytime, so they need to be. So we have to put up these barriers to ensure that we don't disturb the wildlife. Guess we already have frogs out. Let's go see if we can see them. Hey. There. By the way, that was a wood frog on the last part of the video, an early spring frog. Sometimes they come out even on ice. You can see here the soil is pretty sandy, low in organic material, low in humus, and that's partly because we don't have any deciduous trees around. And also this happens to be the path. Over here is a wildlife corridor of sorts. Although it doesn't really connect the forested areas, it does provide some refugia for some animals that would not come out into the open space here, and therefore it does allow for the passage of some wildlife. hopefully you're not going to see them, but hopefully you hear all the wood frogs that are here. See if I can get the red-tailed hawk in here pretty well or not. Keep moving, get a little closer. He's perched right there, kind of hanging out to see some prey items and get a rest. Very common hawk in this area. Let's see if I can. Yeah, that's not gonna work. Here we go.
That sound carries better than I thought.